Hello, I'm Marites Vitug. Welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. This is a show where I get to interview resource persons and newsmakers on issues affecting the region. I will be speaking to Joshua Kurlantzick on Myanmar, where the military junta has taken power since February 1. We will focus on what ASEAN can do or cannot do to stem the violence. More than 700 civilians have been killed by the police and the military in the last 3 months. Joshua is Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Josh, for making time for this interview. We appreciate what you're helping us understand what's happening in Myanmar.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so let's start. Yeah, let's start with the April 24 ASEAN meeting or special summit, wherein they arrived at 5 consensus points. And I know that you've been following this, you've written about it, but there was one issue in which was striking because it says the ASEAN called both parties, in quotes, to cease the violence. But of course, it's clear that it's the military that's causing the violence. So can you please give us a sense of where this is coming from?
The military has instigated the violence by launching a coup on February 1st. At this point, some of the protesters are engaging in violence. There has been violence against policemen and soldiers and just general violence, but the instigator of the entire situation is the military coup. I think ASEAN's statement is basically one in which they want to always avoid. ASEAN is sort of looking for the lowest common denominator that all the 10 members can consensus on. And probably the only way to get the junta leader to come to the event, plus to get authoritarian leaders like Hun Sen and others to sign on to the statement, was to say that the violence was instigated by both parties, or suggest that, and to call on both parties to stop. Because you have so many authoritarian leaders in ASEAN that they don't really want to be party to any situation in which the leadership of the country is being blamed for the violence, for the crisis, etc. So that's always a problem that ASEAN has, and it's been the case in prior crises, and it's still the case now in dealing with this. And the way that they have to operate by consensus can be a problem.
So do you think that this ASEAN summit and the other consensus points is really going to help stem the violence in Myanmar? But maybe, Joshua, you can talk also a bit more about the other 4 points before we go into a discussion of, will this really be helpful to Myanmar?
Well, they made this they set the stage for having a special envoy. They called for an ending to the violence. ASEAN has promised humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid was going to Myanmar. It's being very hard to deliver, both because of sort of the general chaos and the military controlling everything. They called ASEAN has put itself in a mediating role. A special envoy would, in theory, be a mediator. I don't think it's going to stop the violence. No. I think by the standards of ASEAN, it's a fairly forceful statement. But as soon as General Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the junta, came back to Myanmar, came back to Yangon, came back to Naypyidaw, he kind of disavowed a lot of what was already agreed on at ASEAN, and said basically the military would only move forward even with the points of this statement once there was already some degree of stability, or some sort of general stability, which the instability is largely being driven by the military, and the idea that there's going to be any stability in Myanmar anytime soon is probably unlikely. So I think there are positives that can be taken from the ASEAN summit. You could have a special envoy who could have some effect. It kind of depends on who that is. You do have ASEAN at least uniting to call for an end to violence. The statement unfortunately didn't mention that the military is holding thousands of political, or has held and is holding thousands of political prisoners, has jailed many, many journalists. Myanmar's become one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. It would have been good if ASEAN had set some preconditions towards moving forward, like releasing political prisoners. But so, I mean, I think it's a fairly forceful statement for ASEAN, but I don't think it's going to do that much. I'm frankly not sure what policy options could do anything, but I don't think that this is going to resolve things. But a special envoy, it could be helpful. It depends who it is, and it kind of depends how the ASEAN countries support that person.
So there is a separate UN special envoy, right?
There's
And
the UN, but there are multiple others, but yes, there's a separate UN special envoy. She doesn't have a particularly good relationship with the junta, which is not surprising, since she's essentially kind of a human rights advocate, and she has repeatedly criticized the Myanmar military. But yes, there's a separate UN special envoy. It's pretty unclear whether she's even going to be allowed to play any role at all by the Myanmar.
and I think we discussed this earlier in our email. Is that is this the first time ASEAN is intervening in a member country's internal affairs? As you know, ASEAN doesn't want to meddle, when it comes to the politics of its member states. So is this a first for ASEAN?
I wouldn't say it's a first. I mean, I think it may be the first time with all 10 current member states that they've united in this way, as opposed to past times when some ASEAN members would play a role, like during the violence in what was then the Indonesian province of East Timor after the collapse of the Suharto regime. There was an intervention, and the Thais and Malaysian forces played a very significant role in that intervention. So it wasn't necessarily an ASEAN intervention, but the Thais and Malaysians played a significant role. You could go back before that to the Cambodian Civil War and even to the creation of ASEAN. ASEAN was created during the U.S.-Vietnam War, and it wasn't exactly non-interventionist, but yeah, it's probably the first time, at least since the Timor crisis, that ASEAN has taken on this more interventionist role. But even so, it's still quite limited.
So you think, is this situation in Myanmar going to change the character of ASEAN, or make it more proactive in dealing with a member country's problems? In this case, Myanmar.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think actually the fact that ASEAN, if you look back at ASEAN, say in the let's say 10 years ago, you probably had more democracies or freer countries in ASEAN than you did now, because you had, let's go back, let's say 10 years ago, in 2011, you had Thailand that was led by a elected freer government. It was not ideal during the various periods of essentially Shinawatra rule. You had the Philippines, which was freer. You probably had in the SBY period a freer Indonesia than at least now under Jokowi. It's debatable. You probably had a somewhat freer Cambodia than you have now. So I don't think ASEAN is going to become any more interventionist, while ASEAN member states are actually regressing and rolling back freedom. So no, I don't think this is some huge turning point. Frankly, I think the situation in Myanmar is extremely bleak, and it's quite hard actually to imagine what effective policy their options there are. So I don't think it's a failure of ASEAN. I'm not sure what options there are, but no, I don't think ASEAN is going to change measurably.
Yeah, Josh, can you also talk to us about the National Unity Government? For those who don't follow what's happening there very closely, we'd like to know what are the prospects of the National Unity Government being able to meet with the junta? at this point?
So for people who haven't been really following it that closely, so late last year, there was an election in Myanmar, and the National League for Democracy, the party led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won a massive victory in the parliamentary election. The military also has a party that's aligned with the military, and there are a number of other smaller parties, and that military aligned party did terribly. It is true, or I think it is accurate to say that the election wasn't completely 100% ideal. The NLD government, which was in power before the election, didn't handle the election commission perfectly, and there were some other problems. But overall, it was a fairly free and fair election. It was a free and fair election. And there is no doubt that the NLD, that Suu Kyi's party, won overwhelmingly. So for several months after that, the military complained that there had been election fraud and built this up until finally talks between the military and Suu Kyi and the NLD broke down. February 1st, the military launched a coup. They've now been in power since then. Suu Kyi is under house arrest, and a lot of other leaders of the NLD, major politicians, also been arrested or placed under house arrest. So after the coup, after a period of time, a number of politicians who were not arrested, as well as some people in exile, people from the NLD, people who were not from the NLD, from ethnic minority parties, from other ethnic groups who were just activists, formed what's called a national unity government, which is supposed to be kind of a parallel government that's supposed to take the place of the junta government in the mind of the Myanmar people in the world, etc. And they do even have, people in the United States, people in other South Asian countries who are working for them. And in theory, they also could negotiate with the junta towards some future. Right now, I don't think that's very likely. I think the junta probably thought when they launched the coup that they were going to have a coup, and it was going to be a coup with little bloodshed, and they were going to successfully take over the country. There would be maybe some pushback, but they would stop it. Other South Asian countries, like especially Thailand in particular, would recognize them as a legitimate government. The world would not really pay that much attention, and they'd move on. And they'd sort of create a situation where they eventually installed a kind of military-favored party in power, like in Thailand today. And that failed. Other Southeast Asian countries did not really recognize the junta. Most of them did not. The Thai government, even though it's led by Prayut Chan-o-cha, who is a former general, former coup leader himself, didn't really strongly back the junta. The world didn't, just ignore it. And the Myanmar people aggressively pushed back, first through non-violent, very large non-violent protests, and then to some extent through violence. So the military has now turned to a strategy of severe crackdowns, and I don't think they plan to negotiate anytime soon. It seems like their plan is to continue to crack down.
So the National League for Democracy, as you said, is part of the National Unity Government. But does it play a key role in the National Unity Government, or it's not the dominant party in the National Unity Government?
Well, the National Unity Government is designed to be not a one party or a party thing. It's also designed to be, one of the problems that Myanmar has had before is that even when the NLD was really popular, it was very much a party dominated by the majority ethnic group in Myanmar, the Burman Amar people, and all around sort of the outer lands of out north, northeast, and the west of Myanmar. They're more heavily ethnic minority areas, and some of those people didn't feel the NLD represented them very well. And Suu Kyi in particular also essentially defended the military's brutal treatment of the ethnic minority Rohingya in Rakhine State, which is in the west of Myanmar on the border of Bangladesh. So the National Unity Government is designed to be not one party, though there are plenty of people who are aligned with the NLD who have taken part in this. And it's also supposed to bring all the ethnic groups together and create the idea that there would be more ethnic unity, but also that at some point in the future, Myanmar, if it was ever to be a democratic state, a truly democratic state, it would have to be a more federal state, not a government, not a state that was a country that was just run by one powerful central government. And in fact, a lot of the ethnic minority people living in the sort of more outer lands of Myanmar have wanted a federal state since the end of British colonial rule, 65 years ago. So at least one positive thing that can be taken from the national unity government is sort of a recognition by that people who are for democracy in Myanmar or for freedom, they need to come up with some strategy so that it's not just a democracy or a country for only the Burman or Burma people, it's a country for everyone. So that's a positive, yeah.
So just maybe one final question, Josh, if we can go back to the National Security, UN rather, Security Council resolution calling an end to violence in Myanmar. Does this count for much in the scheme of things? Because this is already coming straight from the UN Security Council, wherein China and Russia sit as members.
Well, I'm sorry to be sort of like grim, but I don't think it counts for that much. I mean, Russia actually has taken the opportunity of this coup and the chaos to play a larger role in Myanmar than it did before. Russia has continued to supply arms to the Myanmar government. I don't think Russia has like some deep strategic interest in Myanmar, but it's an opportunity to sell more arms. It's an opportunity to wield some strategic interest. So they have continued to pursue a very close relationship with the junta. China is a little different. Russia is far from Myanmar. And if Myanmar is chaotic and there's unrest, and it doesn't really affect Russia. Whereas for China, I think the situation is more complicated. China doesn't want to push back against authoritarian governments, but at the same time, a situation of chaos in Myanmar, of unrest, a failed state possibly, is going to have an impact on China. And in fact, Chinese officials recognize that publicly. It's going to create refugees going across the border into China, as well as Thailand, Bangladesh, India. It's going to create probably unrest right on the border with China, maybe even spilling into China, violent conflict on board with China. So China's role has got to be a little more nuanced than Russia, but I don't think Security Council statement means too much now.
Okay, just one final question. I think you wrote about this, Josh, about Myanmar descending into a failed state, like all this spiral of violence. It's quite bleak. So do you have any bright light scenario for Myanmar, or is it really it will get worse before it gets better?
Well, I don't know if it's going to get better or get worse before it gets better or get better at all. I mean, just to step back a little bit. I mean, look, like Myanmar has been ruled in one form or the other by the military since 1962. Yes, there was a period in the early 2010s where the military sort of made a semi-transition to, first there was a kind of technocratic government, and then Suu Kyi's party was in control of the civilian government for a few years. Although it never really was in complete control of the country because the military still wielded an enormous amount of control behind the scenes, and now they're in complete control again. So basically, except for this brief period in 2010s when the military still had an enormous amount of power, was the most powerful institution, Myanmar has been ruled by the military for 60 years, 15 years longer than I've been alive. And during that time, every other country in Southeast Asia either ended military rule for long periods and built different forms of democracy, or they ended military rule and was run by some other authoritarian regime. But there is no other place in Southeast Asia where the military is so ingrained. Even Thailand is not as ingrained as Myanmar. So Myanmar has been a sort of a bleak situation for a long time. In terms of positive things, I mean, I think I don't have a lot of great positive things to say. I mean, I think countries in the region should be willing to not turn their back on Myanmar's massive humanitarian needs. It's a hard thing to ask when other countries in the region are suffering, like the Philippines. But at the very least, the wealthier countries in the region, Thailand, Singapore, China, Japan, and the United States. So the United States isn't really, on board with Myanmar. Should be willing to take in Malaysia. Should be willing to take in Myanmar refugees and not send them back to Myanmar, which has been a problem already. Thailand and Malaysia have sent back refugees. They should be willing to provide humanitarian aid. Because it's not actually only just a political crisis, it's also now a humanitarian crisis. The banking system has collapsed. No one has money. It's hard to get money. Getting food is a problem. COVID is a problem. So it's a whole huge crisis that has gone beyond just the political crisis at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh, for that. And we hope addressing viewers in the Philippines and in other parts of the region, that we hope that we don't get desensitized to this crisis happening in Myanmar. As you said, it's bigger now. It's a humanitarian crisis, and we will continue this conversation and hope that we keep watch. And as I said earlier, to not get fatigued by the violence that's happening, because that tends to be the situation. Especially, we have our own problems also in the Philippines and in the region. So on that note, thank you so much, Josh, and we hope to talk to you again. Yes, and thank you to our viewers and listeners. Bye. Bye, Josh. Thank you.